The lightning did not end the war alone. No single machine ever does. But as the Pacific darkened with smoke and fuel and the desperate roar of engines, the P-38 became proof that a clever rearrangement of existing parts could topple myths that had hardened into doctrine. Its twin booms and nose-clustered armament rewrote the textbook by turning the fundamental geometry of aerial gunnery against an enemy that had trusted range and maneuver as absolutes. And that rewrite left marks deeper than any bullet holes. It shattered morale. It forced entire air forces to rethink aircraft design, and it taught a generation of pilots that advantage was as much about where you put your weapons as how fast your engine spun. Yet the Lightning's story is also the story of trade-offs. For every ace who climbed into a P-38 and came home with new tally marks on his logbook, there were ground crews who labored beneath snarled turbochargers, mechanics who cursed at intercoolers and carburetors in the Pacific humidity and the China clay, logistics officers who wrestled with spare parts that couldn't be conjured from carriers and forward airstrips, and commanders who balanced the plane's breathtaking range and punch against its complexity and the training it demanded. In theater after theater, you can measure the device of war in two ways: by the victories a plane enables, and by the cost in time, sweat, and men needed to keep it flying. And on both counts, the Lightning was exceptional and expensive, a machine that rewarded patience in maintenance as handsomely as it rewarded audacity in the cockpit. The P-38's legend grew because it put the initiative back into the hands of American pilots. They could choose the engagement envelope. They could open fire from places their adversaries thought safe, and in doing so they turned the old rules of dogfighting into a new calculus where altitude, closure rate, and concentrated center-line fire decided life and death far more often than turning circles or stick-to-stick bravery. For the Japanese aviators who faced it, the Lightning became a psychological specter, a fast shadow on the horizon that might be harmless or might blossom into a lethal stream of tracer and flame without warning. And that uncertainty bleached the courage from many young pilots who once attacked with confidence. After the war, the influence of that simple, devastating lesson radiated outward. Aircraft designers who had watched the Lightning's nose guns make wing convergence irrelevant began placing armament amid fuselages and pods. The early jets inherited the idea directly, and the geometric logic of centerline weapons survives today in designs where accuracy, not raw weight of fire, determines effectiveness. Modern missiles and guided weapons may be orders of magnitude more sophisticated, but at their heart, they exploit the same truth Kelly Johnson and his team stumbled into by necessity. Put the killing power where the pilot aims, and you stretch lethality farther than anyone predicted. History also kept a ledger of contradictions. The P-38 produced some of America's most famous aces and some of its most puzzling failures. It dominated over the Pacific while seeing mixed success in the European theater, where different climates and maintenance chains exposed its weaknesses. And it vanished quickly from post-war service because the jet age arrived so fast that even a machine as revolutionary as the Lightning seemed suddenly cumbersome. Still, the surviving airframes that exist in museums and on airshow ramps speak to an era when industrial ingenuity and operational courage met, and produced an aircraft that could, quite literally, change the sky. There is a human afterward to the technical triumph. Pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, names that appear in list after list of double-digit victories, were not just beneficiaries of superior hardware, but students of tactics, men who understood how to marry the Lightning's geometry with patience and nerve. And their stories remind us that technology amplifies human choices rather than replacing them. The P-38 allowed a clever pilot to be lethal at range, but it still demanded split-second decisions, cool calculations, and a willingness to exploit fleeting windows of vulnerability. Likewise, thousands of enlisted mechanics and armorers who never made headlines kept those windows open, often in world conditions that would have humbled any lesser machine. The Japanese response, retrofit requests, cautious tactical adjustments, calls to redesign future fighters with centerline weapons, acknowledged a painful truth. You cannot win a contest of attrition if you lose the range advantage and the means to exploit it. Their later aircraft reflected lessons learned under fire, and post-war aviation worldwide absorbed the simplest, most devastating moral of the Lightning's career. Geometry can be a weapon. And so the P-38's final irony is this. An airframe conceived as a practical solution to an Army requirement, 2 engines for range and altitude, twin booms for stability, a central pod because that's where the pilot belonged, accidentally created one of the most efficient killing platforms of the war. When engineering serendipity met operational necessity, the result was not only destruction, but a permanent shift in how wars were fought in the air. We remember the big battles, the charts, and the dates, but sometimes a revolution hides in how you arrange things on a bench. The P-38 didn't invent new bullets or mysterious explosives. It simply put what existed where it would do the most work. And for the men who flew it, and the men who faced it, that rearrangement decided more lives, more campaigns, and, in a way that matters in history as much as in human terms, more futures than anyone in East Hartford or Long Beach could have imagined when a prototype first left the tarmac. Years later, when you walk around a museum Lightning, touch the polished nose, and imagine the pilot hunched behind the canopy, you are touching not just aluminum and paint, but the hinge of a tactical revolution. The moment when ordinary shells became extraordinary, because someone put them together with a geometry that made hitting from a distance no longer a miracle, but a predictable fact of combat. And in that brutal clarification of physics and fate, the aviation world changed forever. But the P-38's legacy did not fade when the last battles over the Pacific went silent. Long after the shooting stopped, after the airfields rusted and the jungles grew over wrecked Zero fighters, the men who survived carried with them a strange, unshakable memory. The sound of twin Allisons winding up, the moment the Lightning dropped its nose, the flash of white tracer fire reaching out across impossible distances. They remembered what it felt like when the geometry of war shifted in their favor. They remembered the day the sky stopped belonging to Japan and started belonging to something faster, harder, colder. They remembered the Lightning. For the Japanese pilots who lived through those encounters, the P-38 became something closer to a superstition than a machine. Reports recovered after the war described it not in technical language, but in psychological terms. An enemy that attacks from beyond visibility. A weapon that kills before combat begins. A plane with reach beyond reason. One Zero pilot, grounded after losing 3 wingmen in a single engagement, wrote in his diary, "We die without knowing why. The sky is no longer a place where men can fight with skill. The Americans kill from distances where skill is irrelevant." His words were not bitterness. They were exhaustion. Because for the first time, Japanese pilots could not find a way to close the gap. They had faced faster enemies before. They had faced tougher enemies before. But they had never faced an enemy who could kill them before they entered combat range. To American pilots, it felt like the sky had finally evened the score. They had spent the first year of the Pacific War being outmaneuvered, outturned, outclimbed, surviving only through tactics like the thatch weave and raw determination. But when they climbed into a P-38, they felt something new, something dangerously seductive: control. They could choose when to fight, how to fight, and more importantly, when not to fight. They could sit 2,000 feet above a formation of Zeros and wait like predators perched on a cliff. And when they dove, they did so already firing, rounds reaching the enemy before the enemy even realized the fight had begun. Many pilots later admitted that the lightning frightened them almost as much as it frightened the enemy. It was fast, heavy, unforgiving at low speeds, and demanded absolute respect. But when flown correctly, it was like holding lightning between your hands, unpredictable, unstoppable, and merciless. Richard Bong once said, "The P-38 wasn't a fighter. It was a scalpel." And in the hands of America's best, that scalpel carved through Japanese air power with terrifying efficiency. And yet, for all its lethality, the lightning carried a somber weight. Pilots remember watching targets ignite at long distances, flames blooming silently until the sound finally reached them. They remember the surreal feeling of firing at a man they couldn't see clearly, only the shape of his aircraft outlined by tracer light. They remembered victory feeling more like inevitability than triumph. And they remembered the way silence settled into the cockpit after each kill. Not joy, not pride, but something colder, something that felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. After the war, when those pilots returned home, many found themselves staring at the P-38 on training fields or museum floors, unsure how to speak about what it had done and what it had cost. Some walked past without looking. Others stopped, touched the cold metal of the nose guns, and remembered what it felt like to fire from 800 yards and watch the enemy fall apart under a storm of bullets. They remembered the friends who never came home. They remembered the enemies who never stood a chance. They remembered being young and terrified and relentless. For the Japanese, the memory was different. To them, the lightning became a symbol of the war's turning tide, the moment when courage and maneuver no longer mattered, when the battlefield began answering to speed, altitude, and physics instead of instinct and honor. Veterans described it not with hatred, but with resignation. "The lightning taught us," one Japanese survivor said decades later, "that the next war would not belong to pilots who dance in the sky. It would belong to those who strike from afar." His words echoed a truth that every nation eventually learned. Because the P-38 was more than a fighter, it was the first hint of a new kind of warfare. A war fought at ranges where the human eye struggled to judge distance, where engagements happened before either pilot could truly see the other, where the winner was determined not by acrobatics, but by engineering. Long before missiles, long before radar lock, long before guided weapons, the P-38 showed the world what long-range precision could do. And that, more than its kills, more than its aces, more than its famous missions, became its true legacy. The Lightning's influence did not end with propellers. Its philosophy, centerline armament, concentrated fire, long-range accuracy, became the blueprint for the jet age. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, the F-4 Phantom, the F-14 Tomcat, the F-22 Raptor. All of them owe something to the lesson the Lightning taught in 1943. Guns should fire where the pilot looks, not where the wings point. Even modern air-to-air missiles, with their precision guidance and radar homing, follow the same principle. One line of fire, one vector, one place for the pilot to aim, one place for the weapon to go. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the P-38 story is this: its deadliest advantage, the one that terrified an entire generation of Japanese aviators, was not a superweapon. It was not exotic technology. It was simply clever engineering. A choice. A design decision that solved the problem everyone else had accepted as unavoidable. A solution so elegant that once seen, it could never be unseen. Yet for all its brilliance, for all the terror it inspired, for all the aces it created, the Lightning's last act was heartbreakingly quiet. After the war, most P-38's were scrapped, melted down, forgotten. Their aluminum frames recycled into cookware, auto parts, construction metal. Machines that once shook the Pacific sky, reduced to mundane objects in kitchens and buildings across America. Only a handful survived: museum pieces, restoration projects, relics. But when those remaining Lightnings do take to the air at air shows, when those twin engines scream again, when that twin boom silhouette cuts across the clouds, something extraordinary happens. Old men, once young pilots, stop talking. They look up, and for a moment, they're back in 1943. Back in an open cockpit, with the smell of oil and cordite. Back above the Solomons or New Guinea. Back in the sky, where life and death lived in the space between two bursts of machine gun fire.